again, my name is Alan Schimmel. I'm editor-in-chief of Devops.com, and I will be your host in today's webinar. And I am very happy to say we are being joined by a person I first met at the Devops Enterprise Summit in San Francisco last year, Paulie Comtois. Paulie is VP at Hearst Business Media, and in that role, Paulie has led multiple migrations to the cloud from several different Hearst business units. Paulie, welcome to our webinar today.
Thank you. I really appreciate you having me on today.
Not a problem. That's actually our pleasure. So I'm leaving the slide up here for a moment in case people would like to read the whole bio, Paulie, but I'm not going to ask you to repeat what's already written. I'd like to move right into our substance. So as I mentioned earlier, today's webinar is our pro tips in migrating to the cloud. And we said AWS, but many of these tips I think are probably relevant no matter which cloud you are migrating to. And let's make no mistake about it, right? It's pretty much inevitable today that you are going to be migrating at least some part of your infrastructure to the cloud, and you'll be involved in a project as such. And migrating to the cloud, it's easy to say, but obviously there's a lot of moving parts and a lot of different methods and strategies to do it successfully. And the idea behind today's webinar is to kind of save you from making the same mistakes that perhaps Paulie has made or lessons that Paulie's learned over the years. So how do we adapt and save time and money by avoiding these beginner mistakes? And that is the subject for today. So Paulie has been kind enough to give us what he calls his 8 pro tips for AWS migration. And we're going to go into each one of these in depth. But here they are all in one slide so that you can see them at a glance. I'll give everyone just a second to notice that. And then, Paulie, if it's okay, I'd like you to take over.
Absolutely, Alan. I think the slides are not advancing.
Could be.
We're still on the first one. Let's just make sure. There we go.
Let's see. Are we here now?
Looks that way.
Okay, let me just give everyone a chance. Okay. My fault. I think I might have had it on pause because I'm dealing on 2 different screens here. I apologize. Here's Paulie's smiling face for everyone as well as his bio. Pay no attention to the guy at the bottom. Kind of what I paraphrased about migrating to the cloud, and Paulie's 8 pro tips for AWS migration. So I hopefully have caught everyone up here. And let's dig in now if it's okay.
Absolutely.
So Paulie, tip number 1. A lack of due diligence. Why don't you dive in on this one?
Certainly. So it really is the biggest issue you're going to face. Everything we discuss in the next hour or so can be attributed back to a lack of planning in one form or another. And of course, you can't plan for every eventuality, but we're going to aim to account for the largest gotchas, the items that I've seen over and over again, somewhat systemic issues that have the biggest impact across business verticals. Really looking at items such as the next one.
Okay.
Go forward one. So we'll dig into sort of lost tribal knowledge. If you take time up front to look into the dark corners of your infrastructure and architecture, you're going to find those sort of hidden gems. And you'll never be able to find all the skeletons, but if you work from the critical systems outward, you can uncover those gems. And it may feel very time-consuming to investigate, the quote-unquote old architecture when everyone's really excited and wants to play with the new shiny one. But it will pay dividends. Some examples of this are things like scripts that have been running forever that move files, and the person who wrote it's now 2 jobs away from your organization, and information about it was archived in the wiki years ago. To find these gems and put in that work up front, that sort of front-loaded work towards understanding how your application works first, is really going to save you a lot of heartache and pain later. I talk about working outwards. The important factor here is not to worry about the whys. A lot of times people, when they start looking into their application and how things are built and trying to map that out, they start to dig into the whys, things like why are we relying on remote data center NFS for the main data store of our heavy I/O application. At this point, it doesn't really matter. If you just maintain focus on trying to understand a higher level architecture and how things play together, once you have that mapping, then you can start digging into, well, how does this work in the underpinning? What are the ancillary applications and scripts? If we notice that this file is created once a day at this time, how is it created, right? And you really start digging into that and focusing on understanding. I really like mind mapping tools for this purpose because they keep things at a higher level and focus on getting the information through activities like brainstorming, as an example. And what you really want to do is just be able to mind map it very, very quickly, get it out, and then you can dig into areas where, example, there may be what I call black holes. Those are the sort of abstracted portions of your application where somebody did something a long time ago. It's just always worked. Nobody touches it. This is especially true on legacy type applications. And so what we end up seeing there is a line going into the black box and coming out of it, but nobody really understands what's happening inside there. And before you migrate this to a whole new ecosystem and approach to infrastructure, you really kind of want to understand how that black box works. And the interesting thing here is that we often take technical debt, right, that we hate so much, and then we carefully and lovingly fold it up, place it into our carry-on luggage, and then take it with us on the trip to the next environment, to the cloud. And then that's where I see technical debt becoming technical baggage. And you miss an opportunity to seize that chance to remove some of the weight that you're lugging around. In some cases, it's not possible to eliminate any, and it's certainly not possible to eliminate all technical debt. But you're missing an opportunity to, at the very least, take the chance to list the technical debt that you discover, certainly stuff that you didn't know was there before, prioritize it, and then work towards making that list public and then actionable.
Sure. Paulie, if I can ask on that, so this sort of reminds me when you're moving from one home to another, or in my case, it's when I get a new laptop, which is far too often. It's a great to decide, what do I want to take with me? What do I want to migrate, from my old environment to my new environment? And I mean, how do you make that sort of decisions, right? I don't want to fold up very carefully my technical debt into my luggage, but how, and sometimes it can't be helped. But the flip side of it is I lose tribal knowledge because I leave too much behind. Where is that balance? How do you find the balance?
Well, the interesting thing there, if we follow that analogy through to conclusion, is how many times have we all moved between houses, and then in the process of moving, we go up in the attic and we pull out a box, and that box is taped up from our last move. We've never even opened it, and we just throw it in the truck, take it with us, and put it in the attic in the new house. And what happens there is it's painful. Getting rid of technical debt is painful. If it wasn't onerous and difficult and painful, everyone would just eliminate it. And so what we really need to do, this is where I like the idea of trying to create an actual list. Prioritize the list based on business impact. Now here's a tough thing for us technical folks to be okay with sometimes. And that is, if you create a list of your technical debt and prioritize it based on technical impact and business impact, they rarely line up 100%. And so we want to try and line those two up, figure out where the overlap is, and then prioritize based on that. And then have a realistic high water mark. You can't do all of it. And so some of this at the bottom of that prioritized list, you're just going to have to live with. But the difference here is you're getting the business to agree with that as well as the technical folks. I often want to have the technical debt removed that is the most impactful to me in my life as a technical individual. But that may not have a positive overall business impact. It just makes my life easier. So getting the business on board with that and trying to figure out, okay, where do we have the most overlap? This is what I think is important. This is what you think is important. Where those two cross, let's tackle that first. Once the business is involved and they agree Now you have things like product owners and managers, quality. You have the finance department willing to back it, and you've got the business supporting that overall change. But you have to tear open the box and look inside. You can't, if you just keep moving it and kicking the can down the road, eventually it's going to be a problem for you, especially if you get a lot of turnover within your organization. Eventually people are going to not even know who packed that box to begin with.
Correct. Correct. All right, so lost tribal knowledge. Paul, if it's okay, we'll move to the next one.
Absolutely.
This is one of my favorites, setting expectations.
I know this sounds like a no-brainer, but everyone seems to have a different view of how difficult and fast this type of migration is. And it's impactful predominantly because it plays on incentives and emotions. Managing expectations is a major hurdle to a successful project of any kind, and moving into the cloud is certainly no exception. If you have a project management office that's handling the migration, make sure that you're giving them concise and accurate estimations and forecasts. Their job oftentimes is not to necessarily understand the minute details around technical moves. And don't rely on the PMO to interpret on your behalf either. If you're leading the migration as a leader, make sure you're present for the meetings and create a channel of communication to your management. One of the big issues here is, I see often, is when you go to these sort of migration project update meetings and people have a certain expectation of when this is going to be done, and that expectation was set based on prior experience rather than input from you as technical leaders. There's a lot of things that can go wrong here. Oftentimes, the migration is based around incentives by leadership, and so there's certain numbers that you're trying to hit here. There's certain flexibility. Maybe there's a PR campaign that people are talking about. Hey, this is very exciting what we're doing, and we're a leading-edge technical company. And then you set out promises about when it will happen and how smoothly the transition will occur. And again, if you're not setting those expectations at the beginning and you're not all aligned, it just makes it that much more difficult for the project to be successful. The second portion of this is it's not a fire and forget missile either. You have to continually update and be very clear and be very transparent. I'm obviously a huge Devops person, and I really believe in transparency and making sure data is public and available. And so this is super important that if there's a slippage, right, or there's an issue, regardless of what it is that you let people know very, very quickly, and then that alleviates you from having to continually sort of defend your position. It can take away that element of defensiveness and just get in there and fix the problem. And if you do that consistently, people will trust you more. It builds that trust in that relationship between you and your management, so that if they are a more hands-on type team, that trust will allow them to be a little less hands-on because they're getting what they really want, which is the information about where you are and where you think this is going to go in the next month, 2 months, 6 months.
So, Paulie, 25 plus years in the technology business, and I will tell you that setting expectations has always been a major problem for me, both in terms of setting expectations to others and me believing expectations set by others.
It's a trust issue.
It's hard, you know.
It is, yeah.
How long is it going to take for this code to be done and ready for deployment? How long is it going to take in the old days to put up a server? Today, I guess it's put up an instance or migrate. And unfortunately, my experience has been that, in the tech world such as this, we really do a lousy job of managing expectations because we underestimate that there's still a lot of art with the science.
Very much
so.
And
we don't take that into account.
Well, part of that too is understanding how to manage up in different directions. So your finance department, for example, is really just looking at the numbers, right? They're not looking at the fact that your team has been up for 3 days straight trying to work on an issue that is now causing you to not be able to transfer the data in the timely fashion you had forecasted, right? All they care about is, well, what are we going to end up on? Are we going to be over budget, or are do I need to hire consultants or contract? That's not part of the overall project budget. And then, if, you've got your customer folks, your support team, and the VP of customer success, or whatever their title is, and their main focus is not on the numbers. All they care about is customer sat, and really looking at, well, the customers are really upset. What are we doing to solve this? What kind of message can I give them? And so it's difficult. I mean, you're talking not about just managing one set of expectations, but everyone's expectations from their perspective. And how many times have we been in a situation where you go in and you say, look, this happened. We all knew that this might happen. We hoped that it didn't, or that it wouldn't. And then you get someone in the room saying, I had no idea that was a possibility. And
Sure.
your jaw hits your chest, right? You're like, have you not been in the same meetings that I've been in for the last 6 months? How could you not know? Look, that's an inevitability. That's going to happen. It's the same thing of when you do a major migration and you notify customers every month for the past year, and then you get the one big customer, right? It's like, I had no idea this was coming. So you just have to kind of account for that and make sure that you do, again, your due diligence, do the best that you can do. It's really all you can do, and try to manage those expectations in different directions. Now, you're going to have to do some contextual shifting between the different verticals that are supporting your move, but that's part of it, right? That's part of the fun to me, is really understanding the different personalities. And again, it really comes down to incentives and emotions. What's incentivizing that person you're talking to? Like, what do they care about? And what is keeping them up at night with regards to your migration? And if you can address those things, that builds trust.
On that note, Paulie, so another sort of personality type I've seen around this is I call it the Commander Montgomery Scott syndrome, right, from Star Trek. Captain, I can't do it for you. It's going to take 3 days, and he gets it done in 3 hours.
Right.
And there are, I think a lot of us tend to say, let me sandbag it a little bit, so I build some time. I build a little buffer for myself. But sometimes that can hurt as much as it helps. Correct?
Well, yeah, right. I mean, the problem with sandbagging is that you're now hobbling the other individual from being able to do their own forecasting. That person is relying on you to give them as accurate of an estimation as possible, with the understanding that there's a plus or minus in there, right? Of course, there's force majeure, there's all sorts of things that can happen to cause a project to slip. But what they want from you is a reasonable estimation, even if it's just t-shirt sizing out of the gate. And then as you do these types of projects, and we'll get into this in a little bit, oftentimes the migration is not one big fail swoop, right? It's multiple phased migrations of multiple applications, especially in larger enterprises. That trust continues to build, and you get a better understanding and trust in your own estimations, and the external constituent gains more trust in your estimations as well. And so, yeah, I'm not a big fan. No, we all do that to some degree, of course, right? Because you don't want to necessarily always come in over budget every time and over time every time, right? So we all kind of sandbag a little bit. I had a individual in one of my previous companies who every project was 6 months. It was internal IT. It didn't matter what it was 6 months. That was his sort of canned answer for everything. And that made it really difficult for everyone else, to try and figure out how they could get their projects into the pipeline. So yeah,
sure.
All this stuff, to your point, I love the idea of it being art. There is some science to it, but a lot of it is art. A lot of it is understanding your past experiences, your biases, and then getting in there and painting on the canvas and saying, okay, we're going to try and create this thing. We all have an idea of what we want. And it's probably going to come out a little bit different than what we all envision, but it will come out successfully, and we're all going to like it.
I hope so. Hey, Paulie, before we move on to the next slide, I just wanted to remind our audience that the question section of the control panel is open. You do not have to wait till the end to put questions in there so that we can queue them up for our question session at the end. So if you have any questions, don't wait and you might forget. Type it in now and they'll be in there for us. That being said, let's move on to pro tip 4. Start small, don't migrate everything first. What do we mean by that, Paulie?
Well, you touched on this at the beginning. Most organizations start moving into the cloud in sort of dev, test, and sandbox environments, maybe even QA to some degree. And that's sort of just dipping your toe in, which is great. It gives people an opportunity to get their feet wet. It gives them an opportunity to experience the environment with very little, if no, ramifications on the overall production and revenue impacting applications. And it's interesting, a lot of times then people will then go from that sort of slow start and take sort of a hockey stick approach and then say, okay, let's migrate everything in 2 weeks. And it's an interesting problem that often arises from time pressure as well, right? You find yourself in the position of needing to complete a 6-month project in a 3-month window. And the solution, of course, is, well, just move it all at once. Let's just, airlift it out of the data center and stick it into AWS. A computer is a computer is a computer, is it not? And that's not necessarily true, of course, right? I used to try and carry everything in one trip. And my grandfather had a saying, he called that a lazy person's load. And at the time when I was a kid, I didn't really understand that concept. It made no sense to me. If I just stacked everything on top and then I carefully moved from point A to point B, I could do it all in one trip, and wasn't that more efficient? The problem was I rarely could make the move without something falling off the stack, and with Murphy's Law firmly intact, it was usually the most valuable item that fell and broke. And I realized that 2 trips were better than 1, and in the end often saved time. And so what we want to do is start small. Most folks have multiple applications they're looking at migrating. And so creating a single threaded stack of the application in the cloud and pulling performance data early is really important. What we want to do here is start testing the different applications and understand how they're going to interact within the cloud. Log as much as you can. This is where tools like Sumo Logic are wonderful for the cloud and for getting that information. We're not even talking production data yet. We're just talking about getting information about how your application its overall health is in the cloud. And then start mining that data for that data for those hidden gems that will prevent that pain after going live. And if you can migrate smaller applications that are less complex and impactful to revenue, those are ideal, right? You don't want to migrate the infrastructure that's going to support that new initiative that's a make or break for the company. Much like automation, not everything should be or can be automated. Not everything should be or can be migrated. Most organizations end up in a heterogeneous environment where you have stuff still in the legacy data center. Sometimes these legacy applications are on quite old code, like VB6 is an example. And you're like, we just don't want to move that. Unfortunately, it's also a huge revenue producer for us, so we don't want to get rid of it either. And so you really need to think about and this is where we hearken back to doing the due diligence, you really need to understand, are there any dependencies between that legacy application and anything that you're moving? And in the excitement to kind of just hurry up and get things into the cloud and maximize that flexibility, sometimes we forget about the legacy stuff. We're so enamored with the new shiny object that we don't think about those interdependencies and ancillary applications that we still have to maintain.
Yep. Paulie, if I can on this one, to me this is also a very similar problem to what we see around how do I adopt DevOps in my organization. Mm-hmm. And I think the advice is the same. Start small, build on success, right? Doing that new European initiative that's going to make or break the company first is, that's a risky proposition at best. But not only that, when we're talking about migrating to the cloud, there are still a lot of doubting Thomases, believe it or not. We may live in the echo chamber of tech, but there are people who still doubt the viability or security of the cloud. And so I think it is important to build, put some success under your belt, build credibility.
Yeah, what we're wanting to do here, much like we do in, say, a Kanban approach to DevOps, say an operations team that breaks its tasks down into manageable cards on a Kanban board, we want an agile approach to the migration as well. We want to make those changes smaller, more manageable, and less impactful should they go wrong.
Absolutely. And that's another thing. By doing them in smaller chunks like that, they are less impactful, and we don't blow the whole shebang.
Right, and it builds trust. With every
Yes, it
success, you
does.
build more trust. So.
Absolutely. Um, but you know, Paulie, in terms of how do we put the how do we agile this migration, right? Doing it in small bunches, and so that sometimes the question is, well, where do you make the cut? How do I determine this is the size of this batch versus the next batch?
You know,
Any insight?
sure. Again, I love the idea of moving an automated dev sandbox environment over. So basically using an automation tool like Chef or something in CloudFormation, since we're specifically talking about AWS, and you spin up environments and you make it push button. And you make those environments in the beginning, say you do a single thread, right? So that's what I was talking about, make a single threaded stack. So you're not worried about HA, you're not worried about multi-zone or regions at this point. All you're concerned with is, can my developer go in, type a simple command, and have a literal running stack that mirrors the application? Once you get to that point and the developers are very comfortable spinning up those sandboxes and tearing them down very quickly, then you can start talking about, okay, well, we want to do the same thing, only now we need to build in HA, we need to really think about moving across regions and zones, and how do we do EBS snapshots, and that's not a good long-term solution, so we really should look at moving it into S3 and maybe using Glacier for backups, and how do we leverage Lambda to operate those backups on our behalf? And so you see how you're kind of building from small steps forward. In my experience, it's pretty easy to get the technical folks on board, especially once you build in sort of that ease of use. It really drives the delight of using the tools and the ecosystem. When you start talking project planning, it's usually the finance folks that you're going to have to convince that you want to take steps and do phase and agile, right? And this is where you're like, look, don't worry so much about the overall budget for the entire project. We're going to do this in phases, and we're going to budget it in phases, and that's what we're going to use as our measuring stick. That's where the CFO and the PMO, the project management office, you have to get them on board with the idea of, we're not looking at a 6-month project with gates and Gantt charts. That's not necessarily how Agile works, right? Maybe we try and move this application, and turns out we have to pivot and move a different application. And that level of agility and flexibility is inherent in that type of process, and it's very important. It's what allows you to maintain success.
Yes. Paulie, you made reference in passing to, you said something that I think is important for people to understand too, and that is not everything should be migrated to the cloud. Can you give us some examples of things that should not be migrated to the cloud?
Yeah, we tend to see a lot of legacy applications, right? Data-heavy applications that utilize, say, huge Hitachi SANs, right? And these environments are very static. There's not a lot of movement or innovation in them. You could call them cash cows. They're basically very reliable, very sturdy, but quite old applications. I see a lot of things still running on Solaris, not within Hearst, but I know a lot of folks that are still running like Solaris 9 applications. This is still really, really popular in financial verticals as well as government. And so when you're looking at moving forward, you're really wanting to leverage, unless you're willing to refactor that code, in most cases that's just not the case, you're really wanting to leverage what the cloud offers. The whole reason you're moving is for that flexibility. Lambda is a great example, right? So one organization has moved entirely out of .NET, and they're all in Lambda functions, and it's all Node.js on the back end, and it's a highly scalable, flexible, web services-based application. Now the older application is still running in the data center, and to some degree there are some ties back, and that's where I was talking about. Unfortunately, there are some calls back to that application, and you need to be aware of those, right, because that can affect the overall performance of your new application inadvertently. So most of the time, that's the situation, right? It's older applications that when you do a cost-benefit analysis, it's like, look, it doesn't do us any good to rewrite this thing and try and move it into the cloud, so we're going to leave it where it is. This can be a challenge, though, right? You're trying to move your ops team and your developers towards this new mantra, and now you're asking them to have a bit of a split brain, so just have to be aware of that.
Absolutely. Paulie, if it's okay, I'm going to move to our next pro tip.
Certainly.
So size. One size doesn't fit all.
So yeah, the
Should we have an
size
extra
here.
doesn't here?
You know, it's a common problem I see. You know, creating a migration strategy that is supposed to be a one-size-fits-all, and this is very problematic for organizations that have, say, 3, 4, 5 applications inside of their ecosystem that they're trying to migrate to the cloud. And it's most often the case where the person developing the strategy either doesn't have all the knowledge of the applications, or they don't have all the right people in the meetings leading up to it, like the planning and the development. If you have a solid DevOps type culture, then bringing everyone together to plan each application's migration strategy and then bringing that all together into a single overarching plan is quite easy and feasible. If you're in an environment that has a lot of silos, that's a little more difficult, and you really need to take that extra step to make sure that the people who understand those applications are in the room. Again, this is hearkening back to make sure that someone else is not setting your agenda for you, right? That's a big problem I see, again, where sort of the PMO says, okay, we're going to do this in 6 months, and then they turn to the technical team, and the technical team says, that's going to take 8 months, easy, if not a year. You haven't told anybody 6 months yet, have you? And they're like, oh yeah, I've told everybody. In fact, it's in advertising slicks now, and so that's a big problem. You need to make sure everyone's at the table that needs to be there. I like to think of all those applications as sort of like my children, right? And I identify which ones are the temperamental teenagers who scream and slam doors and say things like, you're not my real sysadmin. And you need to account for the time and patience that it's going to take to migrate those, right? I'm a big fan of doing the hardest ones first. So you sort of build up that trust, you work through creating those environments, creating an understanding of how the ecosystem works, and then moving the hardest one first. Obviously, a lot of that is dependent upon your environment, the forces that are causing you to migrate in the first place, and of course, your own personality. But and remember too that vendor lock-in can create the need for you to bend your applications to the cloud's will, rather than leveraging the cloud for your application's benefit.
Sure. Paulie, if I could, sounds like a good time for me to cut in right here for a moment.
Sorry.
So, you know, I did a webinar earlier this week on cloud security and the difference between cloud security and on-prem and attack surfaces and so forth. And one of the things we spoke about there is the fact about choosing vendors, choosing solutions which are optimized for the cloud, which will allow you to leverage, you know, the benefits of the cloud. I think, you know, all too often a lot of organizations tend to say, I want to deal with less vendors, so I'm looking for a solution that's going to work for me both on-prem or in my own data center as well as the cloud. And you know what? I think I mentioned earlier on our sponsor today is Sumo Logic, so I don't want to make it Sumo Logic specific certainly, but Sumo is a great example of, you know, cloud optimized solutions versus sort of that one-size-fits-all vendor who you know, makes no difference where you are. We've got your thing, right? And
Right.
I think it is something that we need to be painfully, or especially in security, I know, but in other places as well. The cloud has its unique ways of doing things, its unique challenges, and it probably requires sometimes its own unique tools and solutions.
It's very true. You know, the power of Amazon's cloud is that it abstracts away a lot of the underlying work for you. One of the downsides is that it abstracts away all the underlying work for you. And so if you're accustomed to, as example, running your own VPN concentrators and your own firewalls and your own IDS, IPS solutions, and then you start moving into the cloud, in order to gain some of that flexibility, you need to give some of that control back, which is not necessarily a bad thing. It just means that you need to change your approach to how you're managing these. If you're in a compliance type organization, HIPAA or Frank Dodd or PCI, you need to really be aware of how the security works at a deeper level. So, you know, things like security groups and understanding how the VPC to VPC connections work, Yeah, it's not that it's impossible. It's just a little different. So it really helps to have tools like Sumo Logic that can help you in the cloud specifically, especially if this is your first foray into the cloud. And it really helps to have those kind of, I call them partnerships, so that you can lean on folks and say, okay, you know what, this is how I used to do it. It doesn't seem to work the same in the cloud. If you could help me out and understand, okay, I really need to get this log data, and I need to get it, in a way that is conducive to the two teams that need to see the information, even though they need to see it in totally different ways. And so I think, I think that's not a huge stumbling block because of organizations and companies like Sumo Logic that really help to abstract that away around the ancillary tasks, and you have Amazon really helping you with the core overall architecture and infrastructure.
Absolutely. Paulie, we're going to move along because time's running on us, and we're going to go to tip number 6, know your cloud's limitations and how that impacts all teams.
So I'll just run through this one fairly quickly. That there tends to be a habit of not fully understanding what the cloud provider can't do. Instead, we tend to focus more on all the cool, shiny new things that it can do. And we really want to make sure that you're getting everyone at the table that's going to interact with this new environment and getting their needs laid out. That's another issue. That's sort of a DevOps issue too, right, where we tend to focus only on what our needs are and we don't worry about the other teams. Really do have to understand the limitations of those cloud providers. A common one is the defaults, the number of VPCs and security groups. These are all standard defaults in AWS, right? You can have 5 VPCs in a region. And if you don't have the right teams at the table, you might end up with a team saying, hey, I need a VPC for myself, and we're already maxed out at 5 in the region. We need to put you in another region. And then that causes a connectivity issue, an example. Another example is the limitations on numbering and schemes, and you have VPCs and you want to connect the two, and then you have an overlap in IP addressing. And you've got the two teams pointing at each other saying, well, you need to renumber, or I need to renumber, I'm not going to do it. And that's a VPC to VPC connection that doesn't do natting. And so that's a lack of understanding how these teams work together, or maybe their dependencies or needs. And instead of looking at, say, an IPsec tunnel that could do natting, or having an overall IP structure, an IP scheme that included all the teams. So that's just understanding that, AWS and EC2 and Lambda, these are all really cool new things that we can leverage in our daily lives as developers and operations folks, but at the same time, some of them, like Lambda as an example, is a fairly new technology. It's not running in every region, and so if you're not accounting for that, it can be a problem for you.
Absolutely. Okay, moving on to tip number 7. Your data set is too big to manage during the move. Well, that's a good reason to move to the cloud.
Exactly.
Okay, Paulie.
Yeah, so this is becoming a bit of a thing of the past now, right? And if you went to reInvent last year, they had some great new methodologies for getting huge data sets into the cloud. Obviously, it behooves them to do that. Nevertheless, a lot of times this is a big thing around expectations and not being set appropriately. If we don't stage the data and move it in phases at the very beginning just to test out and try and forecast and create trend lines, we end up, and I've unfortunately, this bit me a couple of jobs ago. We did a major migration into Amazon EC2. This was when it was fairly new. And I severely underestimated the amount of time it was going to take to get the data in. And so what should have been a 4-hour maintenance window to migrate the data and then true it up, ended up being 18 hours. And it's an uncomfortable conversation to have with your CEO, wanting to know why the customers are down for a considerably longer period of time. We even got to the point where we were going to drive to the data center and copy the disks and just drive them manually all the way to Virginia from Atlanta. That's how panicked, like that would have taken less time. And so, you really want to make sure that you're moving those test data blocks to work on forecasting and setting expectations. And sometimes you're just limited by the laws of physics, right? I mean, you can do direct connect now within AWS, and that certainly helps. But you really need to understand how that data works within your current environment, whether or not you can stop entries, log entries, or database entries rather, and just forklift it. Does it have to stay live? Sometimes you have environments where you're working in hospitals and you can't take the data offline. You have to try and make a live copy of it and carry it and then true it up.
Excellent. Excellent. All right, let's jump to our last of your 8 pro tips, and this is, goes back a little bit to sandbagging, right? Overestimating cost savings.
Yeah, this is one of those ones where you see a lot of. The problem here is you're using this to sell the idea in some cases, where it's like, oh, we're going to save all this money, and you even go through and you think you fully vetted the entire break-even analysis, and you look at capital expenditures. And the problem is that it's very difficult to account for 2 things. One, the ease of use to spin up new systems has never been easier. In a traditional data center, you have lead times for everything, not for getting approval monetarily, for ordering the equipment, for it arriving, and then racking and stacking. And so oftentimes there's a mentality of oversubscribing in the data center. You know that you've got this long lead time, so you sandbag with hardware as well. And so what you end up doing is you're saying, oh, I'm going to order a server. I'm going to either make it a lot bigger server than I really need right now, or I'm going to order 2 of them. And in the cloud, you don't have that. And so you really need to undersubscribe in the cloud and expand only when you absolutely need to. And you can afford to do that sort of just-in-time creation of systems and services, because it enables you to do that in flexibility and scope. The downside of that is once you open that up, if you don't have a culture and a process that allow people to do that in a way that's understood across the organization and somewhat boxed, it can be run away, right? We had an issue where people would spin up, like I talked about earlier, we made it to where it was push button for people to spin up dev environments, but we didn't clean them up automatically. People would leave them running and then just spin up another one. And then, before you know it, you have these enormous sprawl. Everything is scaling horizontally, and they're massive environments instead of these tiny little dev sandboxes, which we originally designed. So you really want to be aware of modifying your approach to provisioning in the cloud.
So, Paulie, I will tell you one of my pet peeves on this one, and I don't know if it's AWS specific, because I've really only dealt with AWS, and I'm sorry if that upsets anyone, but this is where I have the most experience, is that it is so darn hard to understand your AWS bill. And I think they do it on purpose. The same way the cell phone people used to.
Right.
You couldn't understand how many minutes you use. Well, I can't understand how many instances and what my extras per instance are, and how does that, I forgot what company it is. They've built a business around explaining your AWS bill.
Right.
And it's a problem.
It is, and one of the big issues there is you end up with folks with shared accounts. That's obviously a bad thing, but it happens. And you look at the bill, and there's 50 servers where there should be 10, and they're all it doesn't tell you who creates them, so you can't even figure out where the problem is. This is where you really need to have that communication, that culture of openness and transparency and fairness, but at the same time accountability. And so they make it very hard to figure out where the money is going, right? You don't understand like the EC2 section of your bill is one large number. It'd be great if it said, oh, well, Paulie spun up these servers. That way I can at least go to Paulie and say, hey, do you still need these? I would love to shut them down. They're costing a ton of money. They're MX larges, and I don't see any real activity on them. But the moment you shut them off, that's when someone's like, hey, that thing was running the database for the front-end application. And you're like, oh, my God. And so, yeah, this is where to overcome those sort of limitations in the way that Amazon is still maturing in billing is that you have that culture, right? That's where you really want to have that DevOps culture where everyone communicates and everyone's on the same page and aligned.
Yeah, I mean, and the other thing is I think just, again, culturally, closing out instances that you're not using, that you spun up to test something, you finish testing it, you don't leave it open for next time you close it out and spin up another one. I mean, that has to be like it just has to be good netiquette to do that, or good cloudicate, or whatever the word you want to coin is. But that's got to be in your culture of that. That's how we use the cloud.
Absolutely. It's like the sign in the break room, right? Your parents don't work here. Clean up after yourself, kind of thing.
Yeah. Don't leave the water running. Put the
Right.
lid down on the toilet and everything else. You don't leave just orphan sessions out there.
Right. And if you build that culture, even what it will do is it'll eventually self-police, right? When someone leaves something up, you don't need a manager to tell you, right? That the people within the group will say, hey, if you're done with that, could you mind go ahead and cleaning that up, and it'll self-police.
Yep, absolutely. Paulie, let's move. These were great tips, by the way, and I think everyone can learn something. And what's nice about them is they seem almost easy on the title, if you will, but when you start peeling the layer back, you see just how complex and all of the different facets to these tips there are. Let's talk a little bit about your own, as you call it, your tiered monitoring approach to cloud. And this is yours, so I'll let you run with it.
Sure. So I've been doing operations and running ops teams for a very long time, and I have these sort of layers of maturity. Monitoring systems in the cloud, the systems themselves, differs very little from that of those in a data center with regards to the three-tiered approach. So system monitoring at the base, application monitoring builds on top of the system, and lastly, customer experience monitoring. The system monitoring gives us what I call symptoms, right? It helps with detailed troubleshooting. It's really giving you things like high CPU, high memory, but it's not typically what we tend to alert on, right? In other words, the CPU is high on a server. Well, who cares? Does the customer care? Do I care? Should I care? But the application health is what we really want, right? And so the application monitoring builds on top of system monitoring and tells us the health of the overall application, and that's what we tend to alert on. And most organizations make it to that, right? Maybe you're using a New Relic APM, maybe you're pulling that information from Sumo Logic, and all of that data is being fed up into those systems. The third tier, and this is normally found at very mature organizations, is customer experience. And this is where we look at monitoring and alerting based on the customer trends and needs. It tends to typically be focused on talking to customer support and understanding the pain thresholds of customers. And taking the input from customers calling in other words, if the call to the database is more than 15 seconds in duration, customers start calling in. So we know that's sort of the high water mark, and you back off that a little bit. And then you take that and combine it with data being fed in from your logs and from alerting systems, such as Sumo Logic building up through that. And then you create alerts based on this so that you can act accordingly. And what we really want to do here is get in front of those issues before the customers call. Now, we all have to deal with a certain amount of pain in our life, right? Certain amount of discomfort and annoyance. Oftentimes you'll go to a website, if it didn't load, you try and reload, right? And if it comes up, you're fine. If it doesn't come up or it consistently takes too long, that's when we start really getting irritated and want to try and do something about it. But we're okay with some minor discomfort here and there. And so while you're never able to fully eliminate issues, like things come up, of course, right? In operations, we all know that we're a utility, and sometimes you turn the light switch on, it just doesn't work the right way, and we have to address those emergencies. What we really want is to get in front of those problem monitors and use leading indicators instead of trailing indicators, and that's where customer experience comes in, and really understanding your systems through logging tools and understanding your customers and their behaviors, and tying those two things together to create a monitoring approach that really allows us to get in front of an issue before the customer calls. You certainly never want your customers to be your primary monitoring system.
No, well, I remember back in the early days of Devops, someone actually once had the tenacity to say that their customers were their QA. And I don't think that guy's working anymore, but or at least I hope he's learned since then. But yes, customers are not your monitoring equipment. But Paulie, thanks very much for going over this with us. We have set aside some few minutes here for questions, and as I said, if you'd like to ask questions into the question section of your interface from the GoToWebinar control panel. We'll be happy to get to them. The first one is an easy one, Paulie. I'm almost tempted to answer it, but I'll let you. And that is, what did you mean? I think you mentioned the term HA, and what did you mean by HA?
Okay. So high availability. In high availability just essentially means making sure the application is available in the event of a failure. High availability can be built into all aspects of application development and infrastructure and architecture. And so typically you build HA into the application itself, so it has to be aware of itself and aware when there's a problem so that it can self-resolve. In the case of architecture in the cloud as an example, if you lose a server that your application is running on, you typically have at least one more server that can be a fallback for it. Typically in the front-end tier or the application tier, you'll have multiple servers running what's called a pool, and you'll have a load balancer in front of that, and the requests come into the load balancer, and it feeds out to, say, web servers. And maybe you have 10, 20 of those. And so that you can, in that situation, it's almost, well, I was going to use another acronym, I guess I shouldn't. I was going to say it's like RAID, but essentially you can lose multiple servers and still be fine, still hit all the SLA targets for your customers.
Yep. Redundancy. Paulie, right. Next question, and this is kind of a, wish you knew then what you knew now. What do you know now that you wish you knew then about AWS migration?
Well, probably the biggest issue I ever run into is really not understanding, again, what it was going to take to get my data in. That was probably one of the most painful migration experiences I've had. The other was not understanding and fully appreciating the limitations on security groups and how I was going to develop security overall. Again, I kind of took a forklift approach to how I was going to manage security and users, and frankly, IAM accounts is very, very different. I had the idea that I would create these VPCs and I would give certain groups of people unfettered access to the VPC that they needed, but not others. Turns out it's not built in yet that you can just flip a bit for that. You need to build those policies manually one line at a time, and that was far more time consuming and onerous than I had anticipated. So that, and probably the last thing, which is still an issue that we're working through, is having a file store where my Nix-based systems and my Windows-based folks have to access the same files and be able to edit them. And managing the two different sort of CIFS and NFS file permissions, that's been a little more problematic than I anticipated. Not impossible, just not as easy as you think it's going to be. Again, when you abstract away a lot of that stuff, you lose some of the control too.
Yep. Next question. Hello, is there any hands-on lab session available to us to practice? So, Paulie, I don't know if he means by practicing migrating or making migration plans or actually migrating to the cloud or practicing maybe something with sumo logic type of stuff. But what do you think?
Well, all of this stuff you can get free tier access to. Amazon, you can go in and get, there's a free tier at Amazon. I think it's a year that you can get for free using, the small instances. And when you're looking at just planning and practicing running through your project plan, I would absolutely recommend doing that. Sumo Logic also, of course, has, and I can let the Sumo Logic folks speak more to this, but they, of course, have demos, and they have free access to the application to do POCs, proof of concepts. And of course, there's tons of websites out there that can teach you about Amazon, including Amazon itself. And if you just go in and create the free tier, you can even do Lambda for free. The first every million calls per month are free. So if you want to get in there and play around with Lambda and have it manage and orchestrate your migration, which is what I've done, it's fantastic. Now you just have to understand it's not in every region yet, so that's the downside. But.
Yes. Stu Great or Paulie asks, you'd like to step back to the cost topic for a moment. Can you throw out some things that you've been involved in to save cost in AWS? For instance, spot pricing,
so data again, right?
Resources, stuff like that.
Yep. Spot instances, the problem there is it's a really great idea. You need to make sure it fits your architecture and what you need, because again, those things get destroyed without you being notified, and it's a very volatile way of doing things. That's one of those ones where it works great if you're looking at putting a bunch behind an ELB, a load balancer as an example, and these are ephemeral, really ephemeral type systems. They're commodities at this point. Of course, reserved instances are awesome, and I highly recommend reserved instances for large situations, right, where you're talking about database servers as an example, things that are fairly static, aren't going to change much. Putting data into Amazon is free, pulling it out is not. And so when you're starting to think about the migration, getting the data in there will be free, so that at least is not a big deal cost-wise. But then how your application serves up its data is a great example of being aware of, like, okay, this is going to be a huge cost. Oftentimes, the data transfers end up being the biggest cost. And because, think of it in the case of variable cost versus fixed cost in finance, that variable cost is really hard to account for, especially in the data center, because you typically pay a flat rate, right? You have a 100 gig connection or whatever, a pipeline coming in, and you just pay for that every month. It's a fixed cost for you. It may be variable in the case that it may go up once in a while, but it's very planned. Whereas this is a variable cost that fluctuates drastically, and so you need to be aware of that and try to understand how your customers are using the data. It's important too when you're in a situation where you've added a new feature, and this new feature actually drives more data coming out of your application than in the past. You need to be aware of that so you don't get a surprise on your next monthly bill.
Yep. And I'll just add that I did check back with the Sumo Logic folks, and they also offer a free 30-day trial you can get on the Sumo Logic site if you're up in the cloud and you want to help try to start managing some of your stuff via logs, some of your infrastructure and apps via logs. You can get a 30-day Sumo trial as well. And there is a perpetual free tier, just like Amazon. Well, Amazon's, I think, is just a year, but Sumo does have a free tier, depending on what you're using log-wise and everything else from a size perspective. Two last questions, Paulie. One is there a security model in AWS?
Yes, there is. It's a multi-tiered approach, much like it is everywhere else in your environments. You have security groups, and those security groups are applied to servers directly, and built on top of that, you have access ACLs, or access control layers, and those are typically like network ACLs. So they're at a higher level. So you start with that, and you can think of that as the network ACLs as being like your firewall at the edge. There is no actual firewall in Amazon. You can buy appliances and put them in place if you wanted to. But typically what people do is they work on the network access control layer, and that really defines what gets passed between networks. And then the security groups are like IP tables on a Linux system, so they're applied directly to the server, so it's another layer down. There are limitations on the numbers that you can apply to both VPCs and servers. Those limits, much like most of the limits in Amazon, can be extended. So, for example, if you have 5 VPCs per region, you can actually have more, but you have to put in a request directly to Amazon for that to be changed. Not a big deal, but again, if you know you're going to need 6, go ahead and put the request in before your migration and get the ball rolling.
Absolutely.
There is some lead time on that, of course. So.
Paulie, we can probably go on longer, but unfortunately we're already 1 minute past the hour, and we have to be mindful of people's times.
Certainly.
So we're going to need to call it a day on this, but I wanted to thank Paulie Comtois, VP at Hearst Business. Thank you so much for a great, informative lessons and webinar on AWS and cloud migrations today. I want to really say a special thank you to Sumo Logic, who sponsored today's webinar. And what I loved about it, we didn't have a Sumo person on here kind of hammering home what Sumo does and how great it is. The fact that Paulie uses it should be, I think, evidence enough of its usability, and if you picked it, it can't be too bad, Paulie. So, but many thanks to Sumo Logic for sponsoring today's webinar. And most of all, thank you to everyone from all over the world, because they log in and tell us where they are. We've had people from Australia and India and the U.S. and Europe and everywhere else. So thank you all for joining us today. This is Alan Schimmel of Devops.com, and we hope to see you at another webinar soon. Have a great day, everyone. Okay.